Hi, everybody. I think we'll start now. My name is Fran Kelly, and I'd like to welcome you to the festival. And this year's festival is presented by the Philip E. and Nancy B. Beekman Foundation, David and Nancy Cintron, Robert Faircloth, the Courtney Knight Gaines Foundation, and the Gerald D. and Helen M. Stevens Foundation, with a special thanks to a grant from Georgia Humanities. We're especially grateful to John and Fran Kane for sponsoring the Jepson Nieces Auditorium today. Chloe Gong will be signing festival purchase copies of her book in Telfair Square immediately following this presentation. And Ms. Gong is with us today, courtesy of Bob and Lisa Banuski. Please take this moment to make sure your phone is turned off and make sure your camera doesn't flash. Really important. As you're exiting today, you will see some lovely volunteers who are holding yellow buckets. This is a very expensive festival because it is free. I can't think of any other festivals that are free, so you're all very fortunate, but it does take money to keep it going. And this year, it costs 30% more to produce the festival. So the buckets will be there, and it'd be great if you could drop in whatever you can. So, and we'll have time for questions, of course, after Ms. Gong finishes. Chloe Gong is the New York Times best-selling author of These Violent Delights and its sequel, Our Violent Ends, as well as Foul Lady Fortune. She is a recent graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, where she double majored in English and international relations. Born in Shanghai and raised in Auckland, New Zealand, Chloe is now located in New York, pretending to be a real adult, like the rest of us. So please give a warm Savannah welcome to Chloe Gong.
Hello, I am so excited to be here, and thank you for that welcome. I really like seeing the reception to my bio every time because I will always get a laugh at that last line. And I know it's a laugh of relatability. I know that we're all struggling and pretending to go through life. So thank you for that. Anyway, I'm so happy to be here. And my presentation is mostly a little look at how I got started into being an author. Because I think one of the most commonly asked questions I get is, how did you get started? As you can see from the little picture, I'm baby. My first book came out when I was 21, which usually meant that the reception across the board was, do you even know how to do taxes? What are you doing here? So, and no, the question is, I don't know how to do my taxes. That's why I have an accountant. Hello from the other side of the world. As you can hear, I am originally from New Zealand. That's me when I was probably 3 or 4. My mum forced me to stand very, very still for that picture. I was very angry. Being from New Zealand, a big part of my childhood meant there was not much else to do. I did a lot of reading. I was a very, very avid bookworm. From that age onward, probably, I started out with a lot of Nancy Drew books and then into a lot of others that I will go into in the next few slides. But I got started very young because there was nothing better to do. The thing about the book industry in New Zealand is that we are very far away from the rest of the world. Books take a long time to get there. My primary source of book acquisition was the library, reading books 5 years behind. So you can imagine when I got to the US, I hugged every Barnes & Noble in my 5-mile radius. So I wanted to show you this. This is the first paragraph of the first short story I wrote when I was 11. It's very bad. You don't have to lie to me and go, no, I think it's okay. It's very bad. I can acknowledge that. It was a creative writing assignment in my year 7, which is I guess middle school here. The assignment was put yourself in the shoes of someone living through the Great Depression when it hit New Zealand. I don't know what was going through my head, but that was the character I created, and it really gave me a taste of the things I liked writing. It gave me a taste of the fact that I even enjoyed writing. And I think we hold ourselves back a lot when we first start because we're like, well, I don't want to write something bad. You will. It will always start bad, and it gets worse. Wait for the ending. So I don't know how to end it. This was, by the way, this was like 5 pages, okay? There was a plot. There was a plot. She's a rich girl. Her family loses all their money in the Depression. She gets hired as a maid for another family, and then she steals jewelry, and then she ends up in jail, and then the counselor comes, and he's like, I think I included that here. The counselor's like, I'm gonna help you, and then the counselor dies. Yeah, so that's how I ended it. I don't know what that says about my 12-year-old storytelling skills, but it is a plot, and it is something. We all have to start somewhere, okay? So, it was after that little taste that I started writing real novels. And by that, I mean I wrote a bunch of incredibly long stories that were really just continuous short stories like the one you just saw. Like, it didn't really have a novel structure, but I was just having the time of my life, like, writing it. So why it kind of started out that way is because I was very, very influenced by the sort of books that were being published at that time. I started with 2 paranormals while Twilight was really, really big. I think Twilight was actually published much earlier than this, but if you were around reading during this time, you know that the paranormal boom happened a bit later than Twilight, very much influenced by it. But, Vampire Academy, City of Bones, I was running a Tumblr dedicated to those books. And it really just gave me that drive and motivation to write something similar. I will be the first to admit that all of my first novels were complete ripoffs. If anyone has read the Darkest Powers trilogy by Kelly Armstrong, my first novel was just that exact plotline. And it doesn't even qualify as fan fiction because fan fiction is skilled enough to adapt off the existing characters and, create content that builds off of that world. I just took the plotline. Anyway. A lot of these early books were forms of escapism because I read so much. Again, there was nothing else to do in New Zealand. I didn't have any other hobbies. There's another whole tangent to be made where sometimes it's good to just let your children be really, really bored. I think this current generation has a lot of stuff to do all the time. Sometimes when I think, if I had a lot of stuff to do, I probably wouldn't have written as much. Not to say you should withdraw your children from all their clubs. That's not what I said. But writing and reading is something that kind of comes out of having time and just the leisure to sit back and let your imagination flow wild, right? I had a lot of that, which again comes back to the fact that there's nothing to do in New Zealand. I cannot emphasize that enough. It is a very, very creative place because of that. But I wrote these 2 paranormal books. They were about 150,000 words each, give or take a few. For reference, that is a very long book. The last book I just wrote, professionally, was 150,000 words, and it's going to come down to 550 pages. They're very thick books. But I never thought of them as novels. I thought of them as just stories. I didn't think of myself as an author either. I thought of myself as just I'm writing stories, The word writer, author, all of those things, they never really entered my brain because it had never occurred to me at this early stage that I would ever do this professionally. I was just writing my stories, escaping the world, and finding something to do with my time. And that's how the pattern kept going for these next few years. So 2014, we entered the dystopian boom a little. I was obsessed. Divergent, Delirium, I think some of the other ones, Legend, Cinder, all of these, oh my goodness. I ate them, positively ate them. And I wrote a dystopian, and then we go into 2015, which I feel like is when the YA fantasy boom kind of starts going as well. First I wrote 3 murder mysteries. I was in my edgy phase. I was in that phase teenagers go through sometimes when you're kind of just standing in the corner and you're like, I know 5 different ways to kill a man. And it's like, no, you don't. But again, we just went through that dystopian trend, right? I really imagined myself like a Tris Pariah, Katniss Everdeen. I actually could not do 1 push-up. I still can't. But I wrote 3 murder mysteries, and this was kind of the point where, again, I had just written those paranormals that were very derivative of the stories I loved. I had just written that dystopian. This was the first book that I had written. Again, I wasn't calling them books back then, but this was the first kind of story I'd written where I wasn't deriving off any existing media. And I had uploaded it on Wattpad. If you don't know what Wattpad is, it's kind of like this online writing community that at this point in time was most infamously known for One Direction fan fiction. It was very hard to get readers because everyone was reading Harry Styles' Stole My Bra. And I was writing a series of teenagers start dying on an island. But even though, it didn't pick up as much as other stories on that website would, given what the majority audience on that website was reading, it gave me my first taste of having readers. And that was so instrumental to me realizing, oh my goodness, I love writing. I love the dopamine rush of people entering my world and my stories. So great. Again, that's why there were 3 of them. I just got a taste of it and I couldn't stop. I just kept killing people. Then, after that little taste, we go into the fantasy boom that was happening in, the real publishing industry. And I was reading all of these books on the side. I was thinking, oh my goodness, I love the genre. And that was when I first started thinking, actually, could I write something that might actually get published like these books I've been reading all the time? Because prior to this, I had always been recreating based on, oh, this is what I want to read. This is what's going to keep me occupied for a few hours. Or I'm going to put this online and this is going to amuse these 3 teenagers who are also just really interested in the weird, gory scenes that I write. But it was around this time, after all of those manuscripts and the current, environment going on in publishing, that I was thinking, I think I can probably write something that will look like a real book that I can imagine on the shelves. Prior to this, I wasn't really following novel structure, if that makes sense. When you pick up a novel, there are things you expect. There's an opening, there's the middle, there's the climax, there's the ending, etc., etc. At this point, I was finally thinking, I actually know how books work. So you can see, I think the year I put there, 2018. The summer before my freshman year of college, I got the idea for what would become my debut. And this could not have happened without all of that background that you just saw. I constantly say this was the first book I got published, but it is far from the first book I wrote. And if I had not written any of the ones that come before it, I couldn't have written this book. Either for my craft, in the way that I tell stories, or just in the way that I can even envision an idea coming to life, this just couldn't have happened. And to go into that further, in writing that debut, it was essentially me trying to create that young adult fiction that I loved, but differently, right? I had spent all of those years, like starting from 2013, kind of studying and mimicking and observing young adult fiction because it was the thing that I was the target audience, right? I was intrigued by the way that it held my attention. I was only reading that because it was the thing that gave me the thrill. Like, as much as I read a lot of adult fiction now as a 14-year-old, I couldn't get past 3 pages of adult fiction because, of course, it wasn't written for me in mind. By the time I got into the age of writing these Violent Delights, yes, I was a bit older, but I wanted to write that book that I would have wanted to pick up when I was that, fanatic 14-year-old running Tumblr blogs for all of those books. So what I went to was, what would happen if you dropped the characters of Romeo and Juliet into 1920 Shanghai? And specifically, how do you do that in the format of those young adult books that you love so much? And when you imagine young adult fantasy, especially during that slide of the 2015 to 2017 boom, which I'm most influenced by, I won't lie. It's usually a girl with sword swinging around making like cutting remarks every 3 pages. And that's exactly what I wanted. I wanted to take Shakespeare because I'm an English major. At that point, I was starting as an English major. I wanted to do something very interesting as far as like analysis and paying homage to these age-old themes go. But I also just wanted girl swinging sword and like really soft boy who cries, but he has like, that smirk and everyone's like, oh, he's so mysterious, you know those archetypes? I wanted to do everything that I loved, but to bring this whole new lens onto it because I had been reading these for so long, and at the same time, I was thinking, what can I write that is exactly what I love, but I'm doing something differently? That's the one way that I could imagine myself getting published and getting onto those shelves. What am I bringing that's new? What am I doing that's not just recycling everything that I already love? Because those were all my previous manuscripts, right? I had already experienced what recycling looks like, because that was just all my first 3 books. It was just pluck a storyline, change things around, no one's gonna notice. But for these Mountain Delights, what I did was, the plot changes to tell a new story. Of course, it is a Romeo and Juliet retelling. There's that whole other aspect to it, but that's a different presentation. The plot is altered to tell a new story, but the themes and the symbolism and the motifs, they're all there from Shakespeare's age. We're just giving it to a new audience. We're giving it to the young adult audience. And that was kind of exactly the way that I approach book writing too. It's all of these archetypes that already exist, all of this work that already exists in this genre. I'm going to look at it again, just as we did with the paranormals and the dystopian and the murder mysteries and all of that. But there is something new that I want to be bringing in, or else it is not as fun, right? It's not as fun to kind of go into something that you've already encountered a billion gazillion times. And now, we've got a whole universe at it. I did keep going once I had found this little niche I tucked into. Doing Shakespearean retellings in Shanghai, 1920s, 1930s, is a very specific niche, I'm aware, but I got really comfortable in it, so I kept going even with my adult debut. That's a Antony and Cleopatra retelling in a 90s-inspired neo-noir city-ish, but, at least that one I took out of Shanghai. But, now I stand here giving you my little presentation, and where I have gotten through this trajectory of reworking stories and reworking the genre, so to speak, is we've got Romeo and Juliet, which I had established in my duology, and Foul Lady Fortune and its sequel, Foul Heart Huntsman, follows a character from the original duology. It is a spin-off set 4 years after the events of Aravalon Ends, because it follows a character who, I won't spoil anything in case there are people in the audience who haven't read the original duology, but very much following the pattern of what I wanted to do. It takes a character who nobody liked in the original duology. I kid you not, when I announced Foul Lady Fortune was starring the character that it's starring, I think I got at least like 50 quote tweets just going, no! Which, I did expect, so I wasn't like, oh, that's mean. I was like, you'll see. And, I'm really happy that since this has come out in last September, a lot of people are now on the side of this character, because when I set out to write that book, to do something new, I wanted to take someone that people didn't like. They weren't on this person's side because they did some bad things in the original duology. They weren't the complete antagonist, so to speak, but whenever you're reading a book and someone is being bad to the protagonist that you've learned to care about and love and want to follow to the ends of the earth, if anyone is kind of like against that protagonist, you're probably going to be like, oh, I don't like you, I hope you get killed off. A lot of people felt that way about this character. However, Foul Lady Fortune is her redemption arc of sorts, and I'm really glad that I got to do it, because it felt like doing my debut again, but with a different experience on it. I was very afraid for how people would see this new series again, because we're going at it from a completely different angle, but I'm very happy with what we ended up putting out. So that is, I guess, my sales pitch to end presentation with. Not a very good sales pitch, being like, yeah, you might hate this character, but hopefully, even if you are someone who hated her in the original duology, this book kind of serves to go back to my thesis point of, you know, I think anyone that you live in the shoes of for a while, you eventually come to understand. And that's all Foul Lady Fortune is. And we are coming to 20 minutes, but I'm at the end. So thank you for listening. But I am happy to take questions, if anyone has questions.
What languages do you speak? And if you speak any foreign languages, does that help you with your writing?
Absolutely. Oh, I love the languages question, so thank you for that. Because I speak English, obviously, and I speak Shanghainese, which is the dialect in Shanghai, and then just Mandarin Chinese. I speak French, technically, and by that I mean I could read things because of all that college study. Can I carry a conversation in French? No. But it is something that really helped me, well, not even help, but something that really informed these books and the setting. And by that I mean there is a particular kind of nuance, I think, when you think in two different languages and when you're kind of trying to portray how life goes in a different language. A particular example I kind of come back to that I think it was a reader who had mentioned it to me a while back is there's a scene in my second book where a character picks up the telephone and goes, your cousin has gone missing. And the character goes, oh, who? This person? And on the other side of the telephone, because they're speaking English, they go, no, like English is too simple, your other cousin. And then they switch to Chinese, and then it's immediately obvious. Because in Chinese, there are specific terms for your younger male cousin, your younger female cousin, older female cousin, etc., etc. And just that simple switch kind of talks immediately to a character's perception of how close they are to their family, what terms of address do they use. And so those are kinds of things that I sprinkled throughout the books because for readers who understand that language as well, they are immediately kind of informed into the world. For readers who don't necessarily understand that language, it adds an extra bit of context that then the book goes to explain. And they've picked up a bit of the world that I wouldn't have put in descriptive-wise. It kind of just exists inherently as a part of the language, you know, spreading back and forth. And I think 1920 Shanghai is really interesting when it comes to language because it was a time where there was so much foreign influence that in true history, most children of the elite were learning English, French, all of these languages. And when my first book when it came out, there were a lot of questions saying like, oh, you made the decision to have them call each other by their English names or to, you know, have these things specifically in English. And I just said that wasn't actually my creative decision. That's how life was in 1920 Shanghai. And it's this, I think it's a part of history that kind of gets lost because now it's not necessarily the same and there are all of these, you know, political influences. But yeah, it was really interesting to research it too.
You told us a little bit about your other books, but what's your adult book about?
Oh, my adult book, let me go back to it. There's the cover. It is a Antony and Cleopatra inspired book. I hesitate to call it a retelling as strongly as I usually pitch these Violent Delights as a Romeo and Juliet retelling because it's a lot less informed. I would say it's more inspired by the characters of Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra than it is the actual play. It loses a lot of the play's elements in a different way to the original duology takes a lot of Romeo and Juliet, the play. I like to pitch it as, imagine if The Hunger Games had been directed by the Hong Kong director Wong Kar-wai, except the protagonists were Clove and Cato, but aged up. And I think that gives, like, if people can catch every reference of that elevator pitch, it gives you a sense that it's about a criminal princess and an exiled aristocrat who very reluctantly team up in essentially what are a set of death match games that the palace runs because the princess is trying to kill the king and completely destroy the monarchy, but the aristocrat is trying to win the cash prize at the end to get someone that he loves out of a coma that's been building up medical debt for a very long time. And it's a lot of political paraplays, it's a lot of violence. I would say that it's like a R-rated movie, probably. There's a lot of blood and decapitations. But I'm really excited for it to come out. I think working in the adult space has felt very different to my young adult books. My young adult books kind of speak to hope and the coming of age experience, even if it is in like gangster run 1920s Shanghai. But Immortal Longings is very much just about, you know, how do different people manipulate, obsess over, and love each other. And it was a lot of fun.
Hi. So going back to kind of the list of books you said inspired you, I noticed a lot of them were written by white authors and had a lot of white characters for the most part. So I guess where did you find the courage to be like, no, people will want to read my stories?
That's a really good question. And it was something that I had to consider, I think, very, very deeply as to, do I want to write this book exactly as I imagine it? Or do I kind of want to soften it in a way that seems like it would be received better because of what currently has, you know, taken over the market? I think for me, I was given a lot of, I guess bravery is the right word, because just before I had published, there was a burst of really diverse fantasy books. In 2019, Descendant of the Crane by Joan He had come out. Prior to that, there was, you know, Ellen O and Melinda Lo writing. So I had seen certain authors already doing their thing. And of course, it's not enough. Like, we still need so much more. But because they existed, I could point to actual people existing and say, they've carved out a space. They've left a path to keep walking. And it gave me, I guess, like that sprinkle of belief that you need to just put yourself out there. Even at this point, I'm like 5-ish years into, you know, since signing with an agent, all of that. And at every point, I'm still like, maybe I am an imposter. You know, that feeling never goes away. And even in the very beginning, it is, no matter how strong it is, I had just needed that one thing to point to say, maybe this is doable. And then I kind of just went for it. And it is so hard to do that without people in front of you there. So, you know, in publishing these books, I was also thinking, maybe if I can do it, it'll help build that path even more and welcome in more and more books that will follow. So I hope that is the case.
Hi, I'm sorry. I'm really bad at public speaking. Hi. I just wanted to say I really like the new UK cover for Immortal Longings. It's so beautiful. Yeah. As like an art student, I almost died. I was like, oh my god. Okay. So as someone that is a really young writer and someone that has had an experience being a young writer and getting published, specifically through traditional publishing, is there any advice that you wish you had gotten or that you wish you could tell young writers out there that want to get published traditionally too?
Yes. Oh, so much advice. I could be here for another half hour. I think the first thing is to find your support system. I'm very grateful that when I first got into traditional publishing, that I found a bunch of other authors who were exactly my age and who just wanted to talk about, you know, the stress of publishing and things we go through, and just, we became organic friends based off of that, just by having so many shared, you know, backgrounds and interests and similarities. But I cannot stress enough how important it is to feel like you have support in this industry when you're young, because the fact of the matter is that you will be the minority. Most authors will be, you know, above 30. They're going to be talking about things going on in their life that is not the same to you, right? When I was debuting, we had this like debut group on Facebook, just everyone who was publishing a book in 2020. And naturally, when you have a big group of people talking with each other, it'll just be about things that are happening in their life, kids, and what their day job looks like. And meanwhile, I was in college, and it was a very different viewpoint. So having that group of people who know exactly what you're going through, you can just type in the group chat and be like, oh my god, like my thesis is due on the same day as my manuscript. Everyone understands, right? It is so important, especially because I think when you are on the younger side, a lot of people will overlook you. They're gonna be like, you need to live life more. You need to be grateful for what you have. You get my point. I totally was not speaking out of everything I've heard. But it is so, like, they will become the people you can kind of depend on when things get hard. And things do get hard for authors in general, for traditional publishing overall, but especially when you're kind of trying to figure out who you are as a person, right? You're growing up at the same time. You are trying to figure out what you want to do as a career. Like, speaking as someone who kind of graduated college during COVID, I didn't know, like, do I become a full-time writer? Do I find a day job? Do I do both? If anyone's curious, I got forced into becoming a full-time writer because no one would hire me during COVID. But yeah, there are a lot of things that feel better when you have people with you, and I think it's okay to struggle is the last piece of advice I will give. It's okay to struggle because writing is hard. Being a young writer is very hard. But I will say, the reward at the end of it is so worth it. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you, in writing Antony and Cleopatra, were you influenced by Anne Rice's book, The Mummy, at all? That's sort of a retelling of one of the early vampires in Egypt, like the immortals. Just wondered if you'd read that book.
I have not read that book, but that is very interesting to know. I will seek it out and read it. Okay, noted.
Hi, I was wondering, out of all the books that you listed, if there were any ones in particular that you think really gave you more experience as a writer or reader. I noticed you put 2 of the Graceling books on there from the Graceling realm, and those were my childhood, so I was wondering if any of those books really led you to grow.
Oh, for sure. I think The Diviners by Libra Bray was a huge influence on, I guess, just These Violent Delights as a book. When I conceived the whole idea of it, I really liked the way that The Diviners did, like, an omniscient point of view to go through, like, the cityscape. Oh my God, it was so well done that it gave me kind of like a craft level up as I was reading it. But generally, City of Bones by Cassandra Clare was the first book that I read, and I decided that I wanted to be like a part of the fandom. Like, there were so many Halloweens where I was just wearing black and I just drew like runes on myself with eyeliner. And then people would be like, "What are you?" And I'm like, "I'm a shadow hunter." Like, it was one of those books where I kind of, not so much in like the craft and the writing aspect, but it made me realize how I wanted a reader to react to my work, if that makes sense. It was the way that I was reading that book and reacting and just having such a good time kind of led me to think about writing not as just the story that you're telling, but it is also a give-take exchange with that reader. Because I always say, if I'm just a writer, I can write that book and put it in a drawer and it wouldn't matter. But if I'm an author, I'm also trying to get it out into the world to, react with people. And the way that they read that book makes it a whole new book of itself as well. So yeah, City of Bones, Divergent, Shatter Me. I'm trying to remember all of the blogs that I ran. There were a lot. The Raven Boys, definitely. Yeah, so it's imagine like the dystopian era phasing out a bit into like the late paranormal. Most of those books I definitely read. Graceling was also one. I don't think I read Into Fire and Bitter Blue though, but I definitely read Graceling. I probably read every single book that was publishing at that point. But I really, really picked up an appreciation for the age category, for the way they wrote for teenagers in those major series.
I wanted to know, was there a moment leading up to your debut where you were like, oh, this is going to hit the bestseller list? Or was it like your agent called you over there and they were like, babe, guess what? You're not gonna
I have a really weird story about how I knew that I would hit the bestsellers list a day in advance.
That's so cool.
But it wasn't through, it was a really, really weird experience. What happened was the New York Times columnist emailed me and was like, hey, so you're going to hit tomorrow. Can I get on the phone with you for a little insider column? And I was like, I don't know if I should be grateful to know in advance or if this is like the most anticlimactic way of knowing that I will be hitting it. So there was that for the reason why I just randomly found out 24 hours earlier. But before it, I had no idea. And I had trained myself not to think about it that way, because when you're putting out your first ever book, the wisdom, and it is very wise for people to say that, is to have low expectations, because you're either right or you're pleasantly surprised. And the truth is, it is very, very hard to break out on your first book. It is hard to kind of have a sudden explosion and to keep that up rather than a very steady climb, as most authors tend to do. And even more, I had been debuting during the pandemic, so all the bookstores were closed, and every other pandemic debut was just having the worst time of their life, and I was like, well, I am expected to kind of mimic that. I think a big, big reason why word of mouth for my first book spread so well was because that was during the first explosion of TikTok. I do, attribute a lot of my career to the fact that Book Talk had just started picking up, and I got swooped into that wave. That's not to diminish my work or anything. I did work hard on the book. I did, do my best to kind of make it a craft that I was proud of, but so does every other author, right? And sometimes luck really gets into it, and I fully acknowledge having Book Talk explode right at that point put me up there. Without it, I would have been a pandemic release. I would have just been on that shelf of a bookstore no one was walking because it was November 2020 and they weren't open yet. So yeah, I really tried to keep my expectations low. I had been noticing, in the months leading up to release, like, oh, a lot of people are excited to read it. A lot of people are saying, like, I can't wait, I'm going to tell all my friends about this. And it's a really good sign. But again, like, being a bestseller is also very nebulous. Sometimes the list just decides not to put you on it. Trade secret, don't tell anyone I said that, but it's true. But yeah, I had hoped, of course, but I wanted to keep myself, on a level of, it'll be great if it happens, but if it doesn't, life is long, being an author is long, writing books is a very long-term thing, and if that is a goal that I have later in life, it is later in my career, later in life, etc., it is something that I can always keep working towards rather than, expecting it from the get-go.
Hi, I had a question. So I'm a writing major, and I just have to know, like, what is your writing process? How did you write so many books, and how are they so long?
They're so long because I can't shut up. I'm kidding. They're also so long because my character casts are so long, and every time I have, like, a revision deadline where my editor is like, can you get me back this in, like, a month? I'm like, oh my God, like most times when you expect it back in a month, it's because most books are like 70,000 words, and then my books are like twice that length, but I still get the same amount of time. Anyway, so in college, I had a very different writing relationship than I do with it now. And the way that it worked in college was that I kind of gaslit myself into thinking writing was really, really, really fun and no work at all, because school was so hard, right? Writing essays was so hard. Working on that thesis was such a pain. And when midnight hit and I needed a break, I was like, ooh, time to work on my book. I tried to not think of it as work, but rather something that would calm me down. That was me working on my hobby and getting those creative juices running after a whole day of like, Sino-American relations are at an all-time low. Like it was, after all of that academic speak, getting to sink into this world that I myself had created, and I get to describe things, and I get to write people like fighting each other, was just so fun. I will say I don't know if that's valuable advice because it's very hard to gaslight yourself into thinking that, but I also kept a very tight schedule. So I made it that I had to do all of my work at a certain point, And then if I had time at night and I wasn't like sleep depriving myself, I would go switch to the writing. I also had communicated very clearly, either like to my agent in the beginning or to my publisher, that I do have to do my school deadlines before my writing deadlines. And the fact that they were understanding and didn't say like, no, you must get this in at this time, made it so that I had a lot of flexibility to kind of work on the books as a, second priority and get schoolwork done otherwise. Since graduating, I did have a identity crisis because for my entire life, I had always been, student with writing on the side. Throughout all of high school, when you saw all of those other books that I'd been working on, I'd always thought about it as a hobby. It was the thing that I did after I finished my homework. It was the thing that I did as a little treat, after I could move from the working desk to the couch. But after I graduated college, I had a life crisis. That's why I'm coming out with 3 books this year, because if you track back to the fact that it takes 2 years for books to be created, 2 years ago I was having my life crisis and writing a lot. I suddenly had so much time on my hands, and that meant I was just writing all the time. Again, COVID forced me to do it full time, which meant the safety network of having a day job, which a lot of other authors have, was completely gone. That didn't exist for me anymore. And the way that it works this is like a really side tidbit, sorry if you don't care about this. The way that being an international student works is if you decide to go full-time on a creative thing, you can't be employed by an employer because the visa that you're on is different. So for me, it was like I can either choose to find a job and do writing on the side all the time, or I can actually be a full-time writer and I have no safety network whatsoever. Which also meant, we often don't talk about this aspect of writing, but being able to make a living off it is actually really important for your further output. If the books aren't generating that income and you do have a side job, it is actually very hard to keep writing those books because so much of your time is spent elsewhere. And it's one of those feedback cycle loops. The more that you have the time and the income to be writing, the more you end up writing. And I knew that I wanted to quickly generate that loop before it was too late. And then I had nowhere to go because I didn't have the safety network of deciding if this doesn't work out, I'll go get a day job. It was this works out or you die. I'm kidding, I won't die. But like it works out or you go home, right? So I created these books out of this very intensive, just creative, mania. And I don't recommend that because that burns you out. But, I had the years following to edit, and I'm really proud of what they turned out. But it was a big learning lesson of you need to carve out specific times for writing, yes, but you can't go too far with it either. In college, I carved out small little sections so that I could get the stuff done. Once I'd left college and I had so much time, I also need to carve it out so that I have time to rest. That's a huge thing to remember, especially if you study writing as well, because things start to merge, right? You need to carve out time where you can just be you as a person and not you as a writer. Otherwise, your brain is just going to get so sapped and squeezed and you just don't know what to do and you're like, who am I? I speak from personal experience. So, I hope that answered your question.
Thank you so much, Chloe, and thank you all for being here and for your contributions. And please, if you don't do money anymore, please contribute to the Savannah Book Festival through Venmo, and remember the yellow buckets out there. But thank you so much, Chloe.